I am going to be reading Chapter 9 of the Geography of You and Me. There was only one square of pizza left on the table between them, and it was no great prize. The cheese had lost its battle with gravity, slumping off to one side, and the whole thing was shiny with grease. But still, Owen refused to give in, his eyes watering as he stared down his father, whose face was twisted in concentration. A few more seconds went by, and finally, half gasping and half laughing, Dad closed his eyes and then opened them again. "Ha," Owen said, reaching for the slice, which he flopped onto his plate. He blinked a few times himself. "I don't think you've ever beat me. You need a new game." Dad sat back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. "How about arm wrestling?" "Not fair," Owen said, around a mouthful of pizza. Even though it had been months, his dad's arms were still muscular from working construction sites. Owen's were alarmingly scrawny by comparison. Dad grinned. "Then maybe we need a third game to decide what game we play to decide on things. The pizza would be cold by the time we figured it out." "Maybe that would be an improvement," he joked, letting his eyes rove around the room, which was filled with checkered tablecloths and lit by dozens of lopsided candles in wax-covered jars. Out of the large windows that ran the length of the restaurant, the streets of Chicago were dusky and gray, the sidewalks still slick with rain from an afternoon shower. Owen finished the slice and licked his fingers, following Dad's gaze to a table in the corner, just beneath a vintage poster advertising romantic Italian getaways. "Is that where you sat?" he asked. "With Mom?" Dad nodded. "Looks the same." "I bet she got the last piece too," Owen teased, trying to pull him back, and for once it worked. Dad laughed, turning around again. "You don't think I could beat my own wife in a staring contest?" Owen shook his head. "I do not." "Then you'd be correct," he said with a smile. Afterward, they walked out into the chilly Chicago night, pulling up their collars against the wind coming off the lake. They'd been here since early afternoon, wandering around Michigan Avenue, their heads tipped back to take in the jagged skyline until it started to rain, and they'd huddled beneath some scaffolding to wait it out, eating bags of warm popcorn and watching the world grow soggy. It had been this way in the other cities too. First Philadelphia, then Columbus, and Indianapolis. They'd arrived in the afternoon and set off together through the city streets until night fell, and they left the lights behind them, finding some remote motel on the outskirts that would better suit their meager budget. Tonight would only be their fourth since leaving New York, but it felt to Owen like it had been much longer. They were taking their time, inching their way across the country with only the concern over finding a school to propel them forward, though even that felt somewhat insubstantial. Owen had always been way ahead of his class, especially in math and science, and they both knew a couple of weeks wouldn't make a difference in the long run. But it wasn't just the pace that made them feel suspended, like they were doing little more than drifting. It was the odd feeling that they'd been set loose into the world with nothing and no one left to reel them back again. Owen now understood that the words on all those side view mirrors were wrong. Objects behind them were not closer than they appeared. Not at all. So far, they'd put 800 miles between them and New York, but it might as well have been 8 million. They walked back towards the car in silence, crossing over the brackish waters of the Chicago River beneath glassy buildings that threw back the city's lights. They were still a few blocks away when they passed the gift shop, the windows crowded with the usual tokens, specific to Chicago but still somehow generic all the same. And before Owen even had a chance to pause, Dad wheeled around with a broad grin. "Let me guess." Owen bristled. "I'll just be a minute," he said, but Dad held up both hands in defense. "By all means," he said. "Take your time, Romeo." "It's not like that," Owen insisted, pulling open the door of the shop. But as he made his way over to the display of postcards, he realized he wasn't so sure. Pretty much everything else in his rearview mirror had disappeared at this point, but somehow Lucy remained, the one sturdy thing in all that quicksand. He thought of her now as he flipped through the display of postcards, the chipped nail polish on her toes, the way her hair fell across her shoulders, the funny little slope of her nose which seemed to catch the freckles before they could slide off. He'd only seen her once more before he left, just 2 short days after their run-in by the mailboxes. After a morning spent packing, squeezing what they could into their ancient red Honda, and then lugging the rest of it out on the curb, Dad went out to take care of some last-minute things with Sam, which didn't seem particularly heartbroken about their quick departure. He'd already lined up a new building manager who would be moving into the basement just as soon as they cleared out. But for a moment it was still theirs, and as Owen stood alone amid the remaining boxes, he glanced at the microwave clock for what felt like the millionth time that day. When he saw that it was after 3, he hurried up to the lobby. He didn't have to wait long. He sat on the bench between the 2 elevators, ignoring Daryl's inquiring looks from behind the front desk. And when she came whirling through the revolving doors in her school uniform, he shot to his feet. "Hey," she said, drawing out the word long and slow. A look of confusion in her eyes as she approached him. There was a streak of a blue pen near the collar of her white blouse, and he was momentarily distracted by it. "Hey," he said, forcing his eyes up to her. She shifted her backpack from one shoulder to the other. "What's up?" "Nothing," he said, then shook his head. "Well, something." She raised her eyebrows. "So it's not just you?" "What's not?" she asked with a frown. "I'm actually moving too," he said, and she hesitated a moment, then let out a short laugh. But when she saw that he wasn't kidding, her mouth snapped back into a straight line. "Seriously?" she asked, her eyebrows raised. He nodded. "Seriously." They stood there for a long time as he explained everything about Sam and the water pipes, about their house in Pennsylvania that was still for sale, about wanting to move forward instead of backward. At some point, he couldn't be sure when, they both sat down on the bench, while on either side of them, the elevator scissored open and closed, making the people inside appear and then disappear over and over again. After a while, Lucy reached for her backpack, which was slouched at her feet, then pulled out a pen and a scrap of notebook paper, holding them out for him. "I don't know where we'll end up," he said, but she shook her head. "Just give me your email address." "I don't have a smartphone," he said, digging in his pocket to show her. "I have a very, very dumb phone. In fact, it's kind of an idiot." "Well, then there's always your computer," she said, handing him the pen and paper anyway. "Or, postcards." He couldn't tell if she was joking, but he smiled at this anyway. Who doesn't like getting a piece of cardboard in the mail? She laughed, then motioned at the mailroom behind her. "You know where to find me. And if you go to London, I'll email you my new address, and hopefully I'll get it." "Right," she said. "Otherwise, I'll just keep sending emails into the void and hoping maybe your dumb phone gets a little bit smarter." "Doubtful," he said, as he scribbled his address onto the scrap of paper. He'd never been much for instant communication or social networking. It was true that he'd need his computer for college applications, and he'd probably have to get in touch with his old guidance counselor by email at some point. But beyond that, he couldn't imagine being particularly plugged in on this trip. He'd never really had a reason to keep in touch with anyone before. Everyone he knew had always lived within a shouting distance, but it was starting to become clear that that wasn't a big strength of his, this whole communication thing. In the weeks since they left Pennsylvania, Casey and Josh had emailed him several times, but Owen hadn't been able to bring himself to write back. And since there were no other places to find him online, no additional outposts in the endless maze of the internet, that was pretty much it for them. Radio silence. The line gone well and truly dead. He'd never been on Twitter and was one of the last people he knew who had managed to avoid Facebook. He was a firm believer in having more friends in real life than online, though he didn't have very many of either at the moment. Even so, when he handed back the paper, his heart beat fast as the thought that he might hear from Lucy. She folded it carefully, then tucked it into the front pocket of her bag with a smile. The kind of perfectly ordinary smile he suspected would take a very long time to forget. So far on the trip, none of the motels they'd stayed at had any sort of internet access, except for the one that was charging way too much for it. So he checked his email for the first time only yesterday, in a sandwich shop in Indianapolis that doubled as an internet cafe. While his dad stood in line to get a couple of subs, Owen sat hunched beside a guy looking up instructions for how to make guacamole. There was only one email from Lucy, who had written to say that they would no longer be going to London. Apparently her father had missed out on the job there, but was offered a different position instead, so now they were moving to Edinburgh. I'm looking forward to wearing a kilt and learning to play the bagpipes, she wrote. My very, very English mother is having a heart attack, but I think it'll be a nice change of scenery, and I'm excited to be finally somewhere. I hope your somewhere is living up to expectations too. Hope to hear from you soon. Otherwise, we'll send word when I have my new address. And in the meantime, I'll be sure to give you regards to the Loch Ness Monster. Now in the cramped souvenir shop in Chicago, Owen grabbed a photo of Lake Michigan, sweeping out from the skyline in a brilliant and seemingly endless blue, and thought for a moment before scrawling a few words on the back. Wish Nessie were here. When he looked up, he was surprised to find that Dad was right beside him. Owen, lost in his own head, hadn't even heard him come in, and his first instinct was to cup a hand around the postcard, but it was too late. Who's Nessie? Dad asked, looking genuinely puzzled, and Owen swallowed back a laugh. Don't worry about it, he said, slipping the postcard into his pocket. You don't know her. They walked over to the checkout together, where a girl with a pierced nose and a streak of pink in her hair was beaming at them for no particular reason. And how are you today? She asked, while punching a few things into a computer. You must be traveling. We are, Dad said, smiling back. Where are you off to? Owen handed her a few crumpled bills. Out west somewhere. Awesome, she said, bobbing her head. I'm from California. Can't get more west than that. Not in this country anyway, Dad agreed. Where in California? Lake Tahoe, she said, so it barely counts. It's just over the Nevada border, but it's a great place. Mountains, trees, the lake, obviously. She held up Owen's postcard before sliding it into a plastic bag. This lake here might be a lot bigger, but the color doesn't even compare. Tahoe is so blue it looks fake. Dad gave Owen a sideways glance. Sounds pretty nice. It is, she said. You should check it out. Hey, do you have any postcard stamps? Owen asked, realizing he'd used his last one in Indiana. I think so, she said, opening the register and lifting the little tray of bills. She dug around with a frown, and then the too bright smile returned to her face. Got 'em, she said, holding up a little packet. How many do you need? Just one, Owen mumbled, but Dad clapped him on the back. Oh, let's not kid ourselves, son, he said cheerfully. I think you're going to need more than one. Owen felt his cheeks burn. I'll take 10, he said, unable to look up. Great, said the clerk. U.S. or international? U.S., he said, but as soon as he did, a little flash of realization went through him. Soon he remembered he would need international stamps. Soon she'd be an ocean away. When they finished paying, they started for the car in silence. Owen was grateful for this. His mind was still busy with the idea that he'd soon need a special stamp just to send Lucy a postcard. It was a small thing, he knew. In fact, there were few things smaller, but something about it felt big all the same. If you were to draw a map of the two of them, of where they started out and where they would both end up, the lines would be shooting away from each other like magnets spun around on their poles. And it occurred to Owen that there was something deeply flawed about this, that there should be circles or angles or turns, anything that might make it possible for the two lines to meet again. Instead, they were both headed in the exact opposite directions. The map was as good as a door swinging shut, and the geography of them, was completely and hopelessly wrong. That's the end of chapter 9. Thanks for watching.